I'm Alan Cowell from the New York Times, based in London. I'm also writing a book about the life and death of Alexander Litvinenko, who I'm sure you will recall made an intervention in this very room not too long before his death in 2006. So I'd been wondering if his spirit would be with us and hoping there wouldn't be any spooks of any different kind among us here tonight. Our panel this evening is a very illustrious one. We have Oksana Antonenko, a Senior Fellow at the IISS in London, two prominent journalists, Alan Philps, the former foreign editor of the Daily Telegraph, and David Hearst, the foreign leader writer on The Guardian, both with long experience of and in Russia, and with a historical perspective, Robert Service of St Antony's College in Oxford, the author of various works on Russia. Our theme is Russia after the elections, the power behind the throne, and the format will be roughly this. I'd like to make a few opening remarks and then throw the debate open to the panelists initially, with a variety of questions before we open it up to questions from you. So I'd like to begin with a couple of thoughts. The first was whether we really should be seeing Russia as a threat to the West and what precisely that threat is. I am one of those people who believe that there is a new variant of the Cold War, but a lot of differences from the past. We no longer see a military threat from Russia. The bottom line of the Cold War was the threat of mutually assured destruction, which is hopefully a remote idea today. Russia is no longer committed to an ideology with a global reach, which is inherently threatening to the Western approach. But there are threats of a different kind to energy supplies, to Western diplomatic aims in the Middle East and Iran, and to the Western notion that democracy as practiced in the United States and the European Union is universally valid or exportable. So it seems to me when we look at this changeover that is about to happen with the election on March the 2nd, we should be asking what exactly the long-term motive of Russia is and why, up to for the past two terms, President, soon-to-be Prime Minister Putin, has chosen to adopt such a bellicose and often slightly threatening approach to his Western partners. So from that point of view, I wonder if it's too early to talk about a Putin legacy, whether it's premature, whether the Putin project is still a work in progress, and we have not reached the end of that particular road. And so finally, I would like to just throw out the idea that we should consider whether Russia today is midway through a historical phase or about to launch into some new approach to its economy and the questions of internal reform. But that's enough from me. I'd like to ask Robert Service about the historical view and where the Putin era fits into what we have seen so far.
Well, I didn't expect to be provoked by the introductory remarks, but I have a visceral antagonism to the view that we should be using the terminology of Cold War. I think that this trivializes what happened between 1945 or 1947 and 1989 or 1991, when two great military, political and ideological coalitions lined up against each other in what often risked turning into a hot war. What's happening now is certainly threatening from Russia in all the ways that our chair this evening suggested. but it is not the cataclysmic scenario that is implied by such a strong term as Cold War. And one of the few things I have against the meat of the new book by Ed Lucas is the title. I think it's quite staggering to contemplate that the threat from Russia now could be what the threat from Russia was in, say, 1945 or 1962, 63, when we had the Cuban Missiles Crisis, or the near hot war of the early 1980s. We have to get Russia into perspective. It is a place, though, that seems to me that presents the West, as we're now calling it again. We didn't used to call it the West. In the first few years after 1991, Yeltsin didn't call the West the West. For a year or two after 1991, he wanted to treat his own country as a normal country within what he called the world community of nations. Now we've got a different situation, a very, very authoritarian regime, which is capable of very, very nasty reactions to any sort of threat. We're facing Russia Incorporated. We're facing a presidential system, a federal assembly, including the Duma, big business, the TV, practically every ingredient, every sector of public life is now incorporated into a fairly static, confident, ruthless, militant system. And I think it does help to understand what's going on if we consider what the potential is for change. And some of the other speakers are going to be talking about the future President Medvedev. But if you take a longer perspective, say a 10 or 20 or 30-year perspective, where do we expect change to come in the Soviet Union or in the early Russian Federation? We often used in the late 1980s to look at the intelligentsia, the creative intelligentsia in the arts and the sciences, the Andrei Sakharovs, the Alexander Solzhenitsyns. Where are they now in public Russia? Absolutely nowhere in terms of influence. They've been dragooned into subservience either by not being asked to write their books or by being forced to write books for a market that is no longer quite as serious intellectually as it was before the mid-1980s. It's often a frightened intelligentsia that if it picks up ecological concerns will find its representatives arrested. In the late 1980s, there was also the importance of journalism. Journalism is still important. That's why journalists are assassinated. The media, however, have been organized under governmental tutelage. Radio and the press are no longer half as important as they used to be. TV is everything in the provision of public information, and all the TV stations worth thinking about are under governmental control. Businessmen have been battered into submission. Berezovsky is over here. Kharkovsky is in a penal colony in East Siberia. Small businessmen who want licenses to run their businesses have to keep in with the local criminal and political elites. It's not going to come from them either then. The clerics have long been suborned. The Patriarch has a very dubious record as an ex-KGB informer. The hierarchy generally is introspective, is highly traditionalist, is not raising its head above the parapet in public affairs, except in really fundamental emergencies, such as in 1993 or earlier in 1991. It's not a church like the Polish church that is acting as the collective tribune of the people. The military is demoralized or bought off by the promise of future subsidies. It's also involved heavily in corruption, even selling weaponry to the Chechen rebels who are meant to be its enemies. Traditionally in the past, the non-Russians have played a considerable role in subverting order in the Russian Empire or in the Soviet Union. But with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Russians are now the overwhelming majority. Demographically, they are in charge. No serious opposition can be organized by non-Russians who have looked at what's happened in Chechnya. And anyway, the leaderships in the non-Russian regions have been diverted into concerning themselves mainly with getting a share of the profits at whatever the going rate is, as established by the Kremlin. So then we're left with the legendary working class. And it did look, didn't it, back in the late 1980s, as if this could be a trouble for the Soviet leadership. There were miners' strikes. There were metallurgical workers' strikes. Yeltsin, if you'll recall, was sent in by his enemy, his political enemy, Gorbachev, to settle those strikes on behalf of the Soviet leadership from which he had been extruded. Now strikes are the exception. Or if they do happen, they're not sufficiently troublesome to the economic interests of the political elite. And the Russian people, whether they are workers or small farmers or enterprise employees, are concentrating on getting through the day. And all the opinion polls suggest that they have become content with what little they get. They get cheap utilities. They won't get them for long. Actually, the prices are going to go up in the next 2 or 3 years. They get cheap vodka. That was one of the big reasons why the male mortality rate was such a problem in the early 1990s. They now, because of the rise in the oil price, get paid on time. The state can now manage its resources sufficiently well to give workers in factories their wages on time at the end of the week, which was not happening under Boris Yeltsin. So the chances of change, it seems to me, I started off in 1991 as a cautious optimist. You remember that our Western media were full of quite wild optimism about good old Yeltsin, just as they had been in the mid-1980s, wildly optimistic about good old Gorbachev. Well, despite that caveat, I did feel cautiously optimistic. I went towards being cautiously pessimistic towards the end of the 90s. I think I'm very optimistic, very pessimistic now.
Okay, could I perhaps then switch the focus a little bit? Thank you very much for that. I think that was a really remarkable look back at the last few years. What about, David, if I could just ask you about Russia and the West. Why is that, and how do you see that being nuanced? What are the various factors that the Russian foreign policy makers bear in mind as they look at different countries in the West? Why, for instance, is Britain public enemy number one rather than the United States?
Well, I think there are lots of factors involved. I mean, possibly, to answer that first question first, I mean, there have been waves and waves of Russian expats here, and welcoming Berezovsky and his ilk certainly didn't do anything for our relationship, let alone let him continue politicking in the way he's done.
So you're saying that the British should be more responsive to the calls for Berezovsky to be returned to Russia or extradited?
Well, the Russian judiciary put, and we may think the whole thing is completely corrupt and politicized, but they put a lot of effort into trying to argue the case for the return first of Zakayev. And they couldn't argue the case of Berezovsky because, lo and behold, in the middle of this case, there came a plot to assassinate him, or an alleged plot to assassinate him. So there was an awful lot of theatre involved in that. And so when we demand the return of Litvinenko, I think they have more than a point. But I mean, in terms of the wider sort of factors involved, I'm not as gloomy as you about Russia, although if you're looking at it from a point of view of a pure democratic point of view, and it is certainly a gloomy situation in the sense that there is nothing, there are no institutions between the citizen and Putin. Putin's held in very, very high esteem, but everyone else in between, trade unions don't exist, the civil society as such is a very, very battered, and that certainly is the factor. There are things that happen in the world that are genuinely a threat to Russia. I have always opposed the eastern expansion of NATO. I think that is a threat to Russia. It may be
missile defense.
Missile defense is another one. What's happening tonight in the Pacific Ocean is also a threat to Russia. What's happening tonight is that three American Navy ships are going to shoot down a satellite which is out of control. It's a military satellite roughly the size of a bus, and they say it's because of all the toxic fuel on board. If you were a Russian ballistic expert, you would actually be quite angry at what's going on there, because this particular, it's very technical and I'm not an expert in this at all, but this particular object is flying through on an orbit of 9 kilometers a second. It's very, very fast, and they're using, the Americans are going to use a missile that they would use to knock out other missiles to shoot it down. In other words, it's a military test. And it's a test that contravenes the ABM treaty, which has already been ditched by one side. And it's, in the time when I was in Russia, Clinton administration were talking to Yeltsin about doing exactly the same test on a ballistic object which was traveling at around 3 kilometers a second, this twice as fast. Now that's a threat.
So would you expect a response of some kind?
No, but if I was a Russian, I wouldn't be happy, for very, very good reasons. Kosovo, what's happened in Kosovo, for instance, we've all interpreted that as saying, oh, well, you know, the Russians are going to reply with the Abkhaz or with successor. Both of those are very, very difficult and stretch way back into Stalinism and beyond that. They are Caucasian disputes. But the link is that if you allow a separatist regime its own state, then the same principle applied to break Georgia, which is a country whose independence we are supporting, and the Russians are interfering as such.
So do you think we're actually approaching a period when there could be, we could be seeing the similar disintegration that we saw in the Balkans in the 90s?
Well, I mean, the point I was going to make was that the Russian concern about Kosovo is not so much about the Abkhaz or South Ossetia, but the Muslim minorities within Russia itself, within the Russian Federation. They're talking about the Tatars and the Bashkiri. And if you look at the Russian Federation as of, for instance, the old Yugoslavia, not a strong entity, but as possibly a weaker entity, then it would be right to draw a conclusion that Kosovo, for completely different reasons, represented a very bad precedent. So, on the sort of general issue of Russian relations with the West, it is going to get very, very rocky. But it also depends on our reaction. And publishing books like This is the New Cold War doesn't help. It really doesn't help, because you can create a situation where this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Thanks. Oksana, can I just ask you whether you see any opportunities arising from... There will be a change of name in the Kremlin. We think we know who's going to win. And does this provide a window of opportunity in any way to revisit some of these issues, or to retune the relationship from a Western point of view, or indeed from Moscow's own point of view?
Thank you. I also feel a bit provoked by your introduction, so if I may say a few words before answering this particular question on this issue of, why is Russia, in your view, a threat? I mean, I think we lived through a period where we had first in the 1990s wildly, over-optimistic expectations about Russia. And, if one looks at the way that the Russians, themselves view the Western policy, and I think we ought to if we try to engage with Russia, support for Yeltsin and claims that what was in Russia in the 1990s was a real democracy. This is something which makes, our attitudes towards Russia illegitimate in the eyes of the Russian population. What was described just in the first intervention, I was, listening with a great amusement. I mean, this is exactly what you described. That was Russia was in the 1990s before Putin came to power. That is exactly that picture. But if you go to today's Russia, it is different. And I think not acknowledging that fact, again, makes our, attempts to try to engage and influence, what is happening inside Russia illegitimate in the eyes of the Russian population. I think the truth is that today, whether we like it or not, and I think perhaps, for many people in the West who want to see, Russia a truly democratic country, it is very bad news. But the truth is that, unfortunately, the Russian government and Putin and Medvedev are very popular among the population. And the living standard of the population, what you described about people, going through the day and being impoverished, this is absolutely not what today's Russia is all about. Yes, there is a major gap between rich and the poor, and this is a legacy of Putin. And yes, this is true that Russia has no institutions left. All the institutions were instrumentalized, to suit the political elite. But there is a middle class emerging in Russia. And all the recent surveys of economic and social developments in Russia show that this middle class is rapidly developing. And some very reputable economists actually put it now at around 15 or even 20%. And this is the middle class, which has a completely different view. If you look at how many Russians travel to the West, in other words, Russia today is not Russia of the 1990s. And I think being that different country and at the same time receiving this overwhelmingly negative view from the West, I think this is what makes Russians, wonder, what relationship we are building. And of course it is taking two to tango, to say that it was just only Russian policy which was, the reason why we have a bad relationship now between Russia and the West would be rather strange. I mean, I think it is on both sides the fact that there is no strategic vision of how to build this relationship. And I think, if we look at, your question about do we have a window of opportunity with Medvedev, I believe we do. And I think it is for us, will be very short-sighted to simply dismiss him as a mere puppet who is there, installed by by Putin and his network, so to speak. Because I think Medvedev, unlike Putin, he's someone who actually has ideas. If one looks at his recent speech, for example, in Krasnoyarsk, I think it is striking how different his vision is from Putin's vision. It was not the speech which was written by Putin or which was written by Sechin or anybody else. That was speech which was written, by one of the most progressive, thinkers among the Russian economists and some Western economists as well. And it seems to me that he truly believes in the fact that maybe his experience of running this state projects, which he was in charge of for a number of years, that this sort of a state capitalism This is a model which President Putin was trying to implement, and very unsuccessfully, of course, for the last 5 years, is a dead end for Russia. Because it produces corruption, it eroded the state, it eroded the institutions. So his emphasis, on the institutions, on entrepreneurship, on private-public partnership and private sector, I think this is something which we should encourage. And I think we should give him a chance. And
do you think he'll have the... Will he be able to dismantle the power structure that he inherits in the Kremlin that's been so entrenched of former KGB, former St. Petersburg allies of Vladimir Putin? Or will those people stay in where they are and influence the next government, whoever's at the head of it?
I think the system of government will stay, and Russia is not going to become a democracy anytime soon. And I think this new model, you said Russia incorporated, but I think one should analytically look at Russia now as a network state. Russia, with no institutions, now is run by a network, which is based on the system of personal relationship and personal loyalties. And that, if we look not only simply on the institution of government, if we look, for example, in the composition of the boards of all the key companies, in Russia, those are the people who bind together with the same background, same connections. And so this network is what Medvedev is inherited. And I'm absolutely sure that this network is there to stay for a long time. Now, the question is there room within this network, to actually implement some reforms? And I think, as much as, we all think that this network, is a huge impediment, to the path towards democracy in Russia. But there is a realization, I think, now widely within the kind of business and political elite, which is that Russia simply cannot go on as it has been for the last, several years, simply redistributing the rent from the energy resources, because that is a completely dead end. And I think what Russia needs to do is to try to modernize, try to innovate, and try to release all this creative potential and creativity and entrepreneurship, which actually is within the Russian society.
But do you think the middle class that the emerging middle class you've spoken of, is that an entrepreneurial middle class, or is it a middle class that would be rather more conservative? I mean, entrepreneurialism normally, from a Western point of view, goes hand in hand with a desire for greater public involvement in a democratic process.
Yeah, we have done actually some studies, and where I'm in the process actually to doing more study. I hope by the end of the year I will publish a book on that. But we're trying to study phenomena of the Russian middle class. There has not really been any studies done on the political implications of the rising middle class. And I think if we look through the various surveys that has been done recently, and I think there's no need to look at the surveys which were done 5 years ago, because there was a major change, of course, in the last 5 years. I think the middle class, unfortunately, is not as progressive, as we would like it to be. And the majority of the Russian middle class are a product of bureaucratic capitalism. They are part of the bureaucracy. They became the middle class because they were part of this rent redistribution network. But behind that, there is an entrepreneurial class which is emerging, and that entrepreneurial class, is coming from, I don't know, oil, non-commodity sector. That includes the, various, everything from IKEA to car manufacturing to the small businesses that are actually booming in Russia. I don't know who told you that the small businesses are not developing. They're booming. If you go to construction, it's amazing. Not only in Moscow. If you go 2,000 kilometers from Moscow, you will see construction booming. In fact, all the statistics show that in the last 3 years, there is more construction going on in Russia than in the entire 50 years of its history in the past. It's just extraordinary. So there is this entrepreneurial class that's emerging, but so far it has not had any role to play at all in the political system, and it is, very isolated and excluded, and it was operating very much under this assumption that if you try to interfere with the politics, you go down the route of Yukos and Khodorkovsky straight into the prison. But I think it is changing now, and we have seen actually on the local level, talking about civil society, there's not a Western style civil society, but we see the interest groups, being that consumer protection groups or various groups of entrepreneurs that are trying to defend their rights. In the last year alone, we have seen a remarkable increase in the numbers of courts, cases where individual entrepreneurs, are trying to appeal their rights in courts. This is unbelievable for Russia. You cannot imagine that 3 years ago, where Lushkov was winning 99% of all the cases, in courts before. And now we see that happening. Of course, it's a very slow process, and as I say, the majority of the middle class are still very conservative and are still vested in this network state system. But something is changing. And I think our policy in the West ought to be to try to understand that, rather than simply, lecturing Russia why it is not a democracy. It is not a democracy, but trying to understand and capture the sentiment and develop a strategy which would empower exactly that elements of the middle class and give them an opportunity to articulate their political interests and then to act on them. Okay. But so far, I think our policies has been, we just simply say that everything is terrible in Russia, there's no middle class, there's nothing, and there is no dialogue. And I think we need to enter in the dialogue, and I think with Medvedev, we ought to give him a chance. I think his chances of success are probably 20% at best. But I think even if we have 10% or 1%, we ought to still try to encourage.
Okay, that's great. Thanks.
You raised the question, though, Oksana, about the mistakenness of Putin. He must have made a catastrophic error. He's chosen a man who doesn't agree with the whole line of his policies for the last 7 years. He's known that man intimately for several years, and yet somehow he's so misjudged him, and he's still misjudging him. He's going to put him into power, and he's going to totally transform the direction of Russian policy. You really have to explain why Putin has made this extraordinary error.
Couldn't we, perhaps we should ask Alan at this point, just to, what's your view?
To keep them apart, you think?
It would help, yeah. You could be the referee, you could ring the bell. But I'd like, how do you see this relationship between Putin and Medvedev? What kind of people are they? Why has this process come about? What does both sides stand to gain from?
Well, it certainly is extraordinary in any global context to see a president voluntarily choosing to demote himself to prime minister. And the Russian president is, of course, extraordinarily powerful, whereas the prime minister usually just takes the blame for things which go wrong. So that certainly does need a lot of explaining. Bob is right. I think these two men have known each other 16 years, so they cannot doubt that Putin knows intimately what Medvedev thinks and wants to. In terms of Putin want to complete his legacy, and he has said quite extraordinarily that he expects to be in charge until 2020. That would give him, from when he was first elected, 20 years in power. This is a sort of a regal time scale. He clearly thinks that he has not done everything that he wanted to do. He can notch up some successes in his terms, and that are strengthening the state. I think he genuinely, there was some US plot to destabilize Russia, as happened in Ukraine, to create a sort of colored revolution, maybe a white revolution against the Reds. He's created what you might call an illiberal electocracy, which is where the ruling elite or elites are validated by regular elections, but the people don't actually have any say. And he's divided up assets amongst a new elite. And he's, in his view, solved the problem of the presidential succession, which has kept people talking, has been the main political issue for the last. Why does he want to become prime minister? I think he said it himself in his press conference. When was it? About 12 days ago. He pointed out that he had pretty much failed in the matter of the economy, and that if Russia continued like this, they were going to go down and down. I don't think there's any question about that. If you look at the website of the World Bank, they have a global doing business survey, which is the ease of doing business around the world. There are 178 countries, and Russia comes out at number 107, which is just near Nigeria. And I think Putin is very aware this needs to change. He probably thinks that Medvedev has some good ideas on this matter. Whether Putin's background as a KGB man will allow him to do that is a very different matter. He wants to continue something called administrative reform, which basically means stopping the bureaucrats, obstructing business, taking bribes, and living off oil and gas rents. That is something which could easily take 20 years, but it's what he wants to do. I think Putin is genuinely a man who is happy in the detail. He's not a man of global viewpoint. He's happy when he's in charge of a dossier and he looks at the problem, finds a way to solve it, and goes to it. I think he thinks he is the man to drag the Russian economy into the 21st century, a sort of Peter the Great, great reformist leader who over 2 decades will change the way the country is run. I would agree with Oksana that his background will probably make that rather difficult, but I'm going to be an optimist and say that maybe this could be a tandem where both sides where Russia could benefit.
But Alan, let me ask you, in looking forward to the future like this and being optimistic, I mean, this is after all a journalist club, do you think we see any improvement in the freedom of the media? I don't think the media has been truly free, certainly not in the 1990s, under the ownership of the oligarchs, and certainly not since 2000. But if you are looking at a situation where you've got probably one newspaper and one radio station with a free voice, can that expand, or will the dangerousness of operating in Russia keep the media trammeled?
I would be very surprised if that was possible. I think the media is considered extraordinarily dangerous to the ruling elites. I think the Kremlin is more impenetrable now than it has been at any time since the Soviet period. We don't know what's going on, and the elites don't want us to know what's going on. Since the power holders tend to come from the KGB, I don't think we can, unfortunately, expect any favors from them towards a free media.
Okay. Well, thanks. I think we've reached the point now where we could throw this discussion open. I'd ask people, if possible, to ask questions rather than make statements, and also to be as brief as they feel able to be, and to identify themselves and any affiliation they might have. Who'd like to open the batting?
Hi there, my name is Quentin. I had a question about Russian nationalism. This is something Putin seems to be stoking with things like the Nashi youth group, and there are kind of extreme right parties that use kind of swastika-style symbols and so forth. And Hitler's birthday is a very difficult day to be out on the street if you look like you come from the Caucasus or something. Where does the panel think this might end up, and is this kind of this patriotism and nationalism kind of stronger than it was in the Soviet period? Where are we headed? Thanks.
Bob, would you like to address that?
Well, in my more optimistic years, in the early 90s, it used to impress me how free party political competition never returned a nationalist party to governmental power. Russians on the whole were pretty quiescent. We tend to think of the Russians as being ultra-nationalist, but you just think of 1917, when Russians were often led by Jews, Latvians, Lithuanians, across all the parties, even a Georgian. Russians have a sort of intermittent relationship with nationalist politics. The depressing side of the agenda now is that increasingly elements of nationalism are part of this ideology. I see danger in the various political parties to the president and his government, and much more danger than under Yeltsin inside the government itself. They've incorporated often of a very kind, as you were saying, the youth organisation, Nashi, is particularly pernicious. I think this trend is likely to continue, and I don't think the West is interpreting Russia. It's really happening. As I said in my I really don't think things are as bad as they could be, and I really don't think we should exaggerate the threat from Russia. But I don't think we can turn an eye to the methods which this corrupt, ruthless, militant elite, with or without Putin, has conducted itself.
Donna, would you like to address the question?
No, just not to make it a debate. No, I do believe that nationalism is a big problem. I mean, I think in particular, so the xenophobia and the kind of the issue of attitude towards the Caucasus group, but not only Caucasus, in fact, generally to the people, racism. That's the right word, I suppose. It's even more dangerous to be black in the streets of Moscow than to be from Caucasus. But I think that is a phenomenon which I think, unfortunately, from my point of view, represents a major danger in a society where there is 15 million Muslims or more, and this is a growing community, and of course also in a society which in the next 10-15 years will have to admit substantial number of migrants in order to sustain its rate of economic growth, and the demographics are such that the pool of migrants from the former Soviet Union has been pretty much exhausted now. So Russia is facing choices of bringing migrants like Europe did from somewhere further far, and I think if this xenophobia and racism continues to develop in the society, I think this can be very dangerous. At the same time, I disagree about the nationalism. I think the nationalism is a completely natural phenomenon for Russia after 1990s, of a kind of, I don't even know how to describe it, but it's a kind of a national humiliation for which resonated not within every single human being. People were ashamed to be Russians. They were ashamed of their history. They were ashamed of their identity. And I think this is, from my point of view, is not a normal, state for any country, particularly such a country as Russia. And I think the fact that, that Putin had tried to resurrect the sense of national pride, I think is extremely, served the Russian society extremely well. And I think this is something which actually began the process of the healing, which Russian society has to go through, and it is very far from over. I think where it should end up, and I think it will end up there probably in 2 or 3 generations, is where Russians going now through this national revival then will be able to come to terms with their history and be able to understand in a more objective sense what actually happened in the 20th century. But in order to get there, you have to go through a phase where actually society, on the level of every individual, no longer feels humiliating basis. Fortunately, Putin to restore this sense of national pride by reverting back to the Soviet symbols, starting from the Soviet anthem and military parades and other things. And that is, of course, probably the easiest way, because, of course, most of the people remember, the Soviet Union or the victory of the Second World War, whatever, as kind of, something which they still feel that, they were more confident about. But the challenge of the future generation, I mean, maybe some of you were here when Bridget Kendall was speaking, and I was struck by what she said, that she once interviewed, Russians, young Russians, sitting near the Monument of Lenin, small town, in the north of Russia, and asking them, who is this man? And none of them answered who he was. None of them. They said, this is just some historical figure, but we don't really know who that is. So if we now have a generation, not of young kids, but actually already teenagers, who don't know who Lenin was, who don't know what Communist Party was. So for them, the symbols of that Soviet pride is not something which will make them proud of Russia. So I think for the next generation of leaders in Russia, it is a challenge to find a formula which would make people proud of Russia, and I should be, and at the same time to be able to come to terms with their history objectively, and will be able not to revert to those rather extreme forms like Nashi. I interviewed personally several Nashis and asking them why are you joining this movement, and the answer was pretty much that where we get the free tickets to disco and free trips to Moscow with nice girls in the bus. So it's not actually the issue of ideology for teenagers. It's a kind of rallying for the majority of them. But of course it has been used as an instrument of the state, and I think it is very, of course, counterproductive.
Okay, do we have any questions from, could you like to?
Hello,
Questions for Professor Service. As an historian, we all know that Russia has a slightly complicated relationship with its neighbors, always has done. And Britain, one way or another, took part in various decision-making which had an impact on those neighbors, historically speaking, like the agreement. What do you think should be the role of Britain these days, if it doesn't want to or can't interfere with Russian bizarre democracy? Should it have any say in say mediation between Russia and these new democracies that neighbor Russia?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm a bit cantankerous about this. I think that the Blair administration was... I said the Blair administration, didn't I? I mean Blair. Tony Blair was very misguided to think that sofa diplomacy with a man like Putin was the key to a harmonious and productive relationship. I don't think we had real diplomacy in the late 1980s, early 2000s. We had the idea that if boys could be chums, and if their wives could be pals as well, and if photo shoots could be accomplished, then all would be well between Britain and Russia, and Britain could become a bridge to the USA. Whatever maniac might be in power at the time in Washington, this was a failure of the nation. It was so catastrophic that we're only now recovering from it with a puritanical, sober-minded, cautious Scotsman who is unlikely to sit with anybody on a sofa without the partner on the sofa feeling a little uncomfortable. I don't think Britain should exaggerate what it can do. We're not a big player in the world. We can, however, avoid changing the climate in ways that bigger powers, the big power, America, wants us to change it. We can at least conduct a moderately autonomous foreign policy. It's going to be extremely difficult because there is no European policy. There is no Western policy on gas or oil. That's the real thing, isn't it, that we're really worried about. It's the acquisition of fuel for our homes and for our vehicles and for the running of our economy. Were the oil price to collapse, which no economist thinks is going to happen in the near future, but what do they know? 1973, Brezhnev got lucky. The whole Soviet economy was propped up by courtesy of the Arab oil hike of the mid-70s. Gorbachev got unlucky. There was a catastrophic fall in the oil price in 1986, just at the point when he was starting perestroika. He came to power a year before, and his revenues plummeted. We all get transfixed with the magician in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, who's apparently got supernatural political skills. He doesn't have supernatural skill. He got lucky. The financial turbulence in 1998, coupled with the massive rise in oil prices, has turned this man into a political genius in the eyes of global opinion. If it all went the other way, that would make the big difference. Britain ought to be sober, ought to cultivate its interests, ought to be trying to put together a diplomatic coalition in Europe. It's going to be extremely difficult because the Italians and the Germans are even more dependent on Russian energy resources than we are. That pass was sold 20, 30 years ago. You only had to visit northern Italy to see those mountains scoured by pipelines that then turned out to be Soviet pipelines, to know that it's going to be very, very difficult to achieve this. But it's a bit like the road to Dublin. I wouldn't have started here. I certainly wouldn't have started with the ridiculous diplomacy of Tony Blair.
Right.
Can I say a quick historical note about Soviet diplomacy? It did work with Gorbachev and Yeltsin. They were suckers for photo opportunities, having nice things written about their wives abroad and things like that. Of course, they had no oil revenues, but I think it's worked with 2 out of 3, should we put it that way.
That's a good point, yeah.
So take our next question.
Pavel Andreev, Russian journalist here in London. I was astounded listening to your first information. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, you are calling to he himself supports President Putin. The journalists are much times less killed in Putin's Russia than it was in the 90s, and so on and so forth. But I was going to address another question which the chairman picked up about the opportunity window for Medvedev. Oksana took up the domestic perspective of it, and I was very good one. But however, I wouldn't see that big difference between Medvedev and Putin, because Putin's speech, which was preceding Medvedev's, was pretty much about innovation and modernizing the economy. So there's probably a general trend of the elites towards that line. But Bob Blackwell in IISS was speaking this week and also addressing that the relations between the West and Russia can be mended by cutting down, curtailing critique of domestic policies and not interfering into domestic policies. But I can see that the relations between the West and Russia are very tense also because of the damage, because of the foreign policy and principle, strategic failure to listen to each other in the foreign political sphere. Do you see the window of opportunity here in foreign policy?
David, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I mean it really does depend on the next crisis, because it is very, very crisis driven. It's driven by tactics, not by strategy. I mean, I think for all the talk of Russian nationalism, it is we're still waiting for Russian diplomacy. In many senses, particularly in their near abroad, Russian diplomacy is a contradiction in terms. And Russia really could use the fact that an awful lot of people speak Russian to get the message across much better, rather than chucking Georgians out of Moscow. Those devices are so primitive that it does enormous damage. And I think Russia should be doing everything it can to establish relations in its near abroad, which are commercially based, but without the threat and without responding or without awakening, the image of the bear and of the bully. And it reverts to that too often. In terms of Russia and the West, I think I'm actually much more sympathetic to Russia. It is very easy to see how a weaker power like Russia is being threatened by bases all over the place and by missile defense. Obviously, I mean, if you're a Pole or a Czech, you see things completely differently. Their countries were nearly wiped out in the last century, but that is not a reason why that view should dictate the strategic view. and I think a strategic view of sort of Western and Russian relations should be pragmatic and sober. As for, do we have the right to talk about journalists, and do we have the right to talk about human rights? Yes, we do, but not to preach to Russia. And we should also realize that the time when Russia listened to us, when we had Yeltsin in power, when you could meet all sorts of sort of mad monetarists saying, I've just written the latest decree, it's just about to be published. That's over, that's finished, that's gone, and good riddance. We made a complete mess of the time in which the window was wide open for us. And I agree really with Oksana that the thing that we can't get our head around is the fact that Putin is overwhelmingly popular. He is popular, and he's popular not for democratic reasons, but for the real sense of fear and instability that happened during both Gorbachev and Yeltsin. While we were saying, this is marvelous, this is great, this is a revolution. The Russians, I'm not speaking for Russians, I wouldn't dream of speaking for a Russian, but what I observed was fear. Fear of civil war, fear of all sorts of things were going on. And we don't appreciate that. We just simply say, no, that was the time when we should have dragged, that was democracy, that was when we and we have, in a sense, realized our mistake, not in Russia, but we've realized it in Baghdad in Iraq. We did this, we made the same mistake with de-Baathification. And the Americans have realized this now in a big way, into trying to rebuild the institutions of Iraq and finding that. That process started with Clinton and with Russia. And so when it comes to us saying institutions should be rebuilt, we should be the last people to say it.
But can I, well, I was going to just, if I could, just, if you were looking at it from a Russian perspective, what would you see as the final goal of foreign policy? Where would you like to be in the world?
Defend Russia's borders. Defend Russia's interests. Now, that's a very, very complicated subject, because what are Russia's borders? If you're an Orthodox believer, then they stray well into Ukraine. Where does Russia start? Where does it stop? That's a real historical problem. But you could start with the Russian Federation itself. And also, what you'd want is respect. What you want is some sign that the other party is taking your views into account. And at the moment, that isn't happening. It is still, policy is still, not just for Russia, but for vast numbers of sort of non-Western countries. Policy is something that's decided that you have to react to because there's a unilateralism around.
Can I just add, answer to the question of, Pavel asked whether we have a window of opportunity now to start, changing relationship, within Russia and the West. I think my sad answer to that is no, and I think it is tragic. It is tragic for Europe, it is tragic for Russia. I was in Russia 2 weeks ago, exactly with this question, trying to talk to the Russian political elite. And I was just struck to what extent there is a complete sense of bitterness, sort of lack of understanding, and most importantly, lack of interest to engage anymore with Europe, and the West in general. And I think it is very much because of the legacy of the 1990s, but not only that. I think it is also because, our Western policy towards Russia has been now for many years to constantly lecture Russia of how it should live its life, at the same time without ever recognizing that Russia had any legitimate interest whatsoever. We said that every interest that Russians try to articulate, and I agree completely, Russians do not have a diplomacy, but I also think we don't have a diplomacy, because this lecturing and the statements and saying what we want to hear is a substitute for diplomacy. It is not a diplomacy. And I think Bob Blackwell, quite rightly said at this meeting that, quoting Churchill, that, no matter how much we like, what we say, and we like our strategy, we should at least from time to time look at the results. And our results are that we have completely lost any constituency within Russian population, business or political elite, which has any patience anymore to listen or engage with Europe and the West. And I think this is tragic. And on the European side, similarly, you know, even though I disagree actually with Robert, not surprisingly, about Tony Blair, I think Tony Blair was very courageous when he went to see Putin, and a lot of good came out of it. One of that things, Russia-NATO Council. I still believe that the Russia-NATO Council, with all its faults, is really the only institution which has managed to overcome, in whatever small way, the legacy of the Cold War we had. And this is the only institution where we had a real debate, you know, and military to military, you know, dialogue. And this is something which will help us overcome all this misunderstanding and other things. But now we don't have a single leader in Europe, you know, think about that, that is able to actually, you know, elaborate what we can offer to Russia in terms of our pragmatic relationship. And it doesn't mean that we need to, you know, completely be blinded by the human rights and democracy issue. No, of course, we need to not only engage with them on this issue, we should try to influence and empower people who can deliver, you know, eventually democracy in Russia. But what we are doing with our policy, we are making it less likely that Russians are going to listen, you know, about the, you know, democracy than more likely. So therefore, I'm very pessimistic, and I think it is very sad that today we have no opportunity. Maybe the U.S. elections, you know, and as much as, you know, we, with a new democratic administration in power, if we hear what Obama says and what Hillary Clinton says, you know, actually their views on Russia perhaps, you know, are more pragmatic than what we hear now, you know, either from, you know, from the current Bush administration or Europe. So maybe we need to wait for a year until we actually have some new engagement and dialogue.
Okay, next question. Back there.
I'm Charles Clover. Just wondering what you all make of Putin's astronomical approval ratings. I mean, clearly he's popular, clearly his policies are popular, clearly he has a mandate to do what he's done. Can you conclude from that that the Russian people don't really care very much about democracy and civil society and freedom and things like that?
Alan and then Robert.
I think you have to see these things in terms of the 1990s, which we've rather been banging on about, but during the 1980s and 1990s, the country fell apart literally, and in terms of society, the educated certainly found themselves, a lot of them, without a job. There was a great fear of change, and at the same time, the whole Western world was clapping Gorbachev and Yeltsin and saying this is the best thing that's happened to Russia since God knows when, I can't think. So democracy has got a very bad name. It seems to many Russians, I couldn't put a figure on it, to be some way of weakening a former superpower and reducing it to middle-ranking power status. It seems to be a source of dysfunction in society. And I think there's a certain element of truth, certainly in the way that the West was very happy to see the Soviet Union fall apart and no longer be a major power. As for the role of civil society and NGOs, I think Putin genuinely believed that there was some kind of plot being hatched to destabilize his regime, as happened in the color revolutions in Ukraine, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan. Now, I don't myself believe that that was true, but he saw that NGOs and the media were stoked up with American money, Berezovsky's money probably too, as much as anybody else's. He put two and two together and decided that he was not going to permit this, and used all the resources of the state to reinforce this view that NGOs were working for foreign intelligence, including the British Council. So as regards democracy, it has a bad name. As regards civil society and NGOs, I think that's largely created by the Kremlin's dominance of the media.
Yeah, I go along with that. The point I would add, though, is that if you look at the big opinion polls of the last few years, Putin always comes out very, very high, unless he's really messed up, as he did over the Kursk submarine disaster, when he behaved really so ineffectually and casually as to drop down to levels that most prime ministers in this country would be proud of still. But now he's scoring 60, 70% on the headline question, are you for or against Putin? But when these opinion surveys go to subsidiary questions, such as, do you approve of what Putin has done, or do you think he's done a good job in Chechnya, he scores very low. In other words, Russians are a little bit schizophrenic. And when they're asked very specific questions that they can relate to at a particular level, they're not so pro-Putin, they're not so pro their government. And I feel that we sometimes underestimate the eruptive possibilities in all of this. Just as probably people did in the late 1950s. It looked as if Khrushchev was completely in charge. Or 1916, it looked as if Nikolai II was there for life and his hemophiliac son. In fact, cataclysmic events suddenly volcanically occurred, took every expert by surprise. I don't think we should think that just because there's quiescence at the moment, that Russians wouldn't react to what they regarded as, say, a policy of egregious unfairness that they wouldn't ever take to the streets. The very fact that they're so tranquil, they're so accepting, shouldn't lead us to think that this is always going to be what happens in Russia. I mean, I don't want to say this is an optimistic way of looking at it, because it could be absolutely terrible.
But what would trigger that? I mean, what kind of event?
Well, a sudden decline in the standard of living caused by some event on world markets.
Oil markets.
And this is an enormously corrupt elite. They've had windfall profits beyond the imagination of man. I mean, there's only one country that's had anything like this, and that's Saudi Arabia. The windfall has not been given in its entirety, or even in its majority, to the population. These fat cats in Gazprom, in all of the big energy companies, including Putin himself. This is a man who's a multi-billionaire. They have pocketed it. Most of it has been pocketed. If world markets turn in the wrong direction for this elite, we shouldn't be surprised if something happens on, I was going to say, the streets of Petrograd. I'm an old scholar on the Russian Revolution. It comes back to you in these sort of ways. Well, you know, they're not going to put up with it forever if they don't get a steady guarantee of at least. Oksana's right. The standard of living has improved, but not all that. There is still a very, very large number of people in Russia who are living below the UN poverty level, and very little is being done for these poor devils.
Should I sell my Gazprom shares?
Can I say?
I should become a consultant.
Questions about that.
David, quick. Do you give any credence to the idea that it was actually the authorities that were behind the apartment bombings? I see, but no less a person than our former scientific advisor, Sir David King, is persuaded that the evidence points in that direction. And if that was so, would Putin's popularity hold up on the basis that this was a legitimate price to pay for the stability that has now been achieved?
David, would you like to address that?
I think there was something very, very dodgy about at least one of the bombings. I'm not going to express an opinion of who did it. I don't think it was the Chechens. Because they don't do that. They're not flat bombings. They do other things, but not that.
Alan, perhaps you'd like to...
Would it change the way people thought?
Would it change the way people thought about it? No, it wouldn't.
Well, I find it difficult actually to speak on behalf of the Russian people here, because I'm not Russian, and it's a hypothetical question. I would say that at the risk of stereotyping, I'd have thought a lot of people would be very shocked, actually. Though, I mean, it's history now, isn't it?
Thanks. Mary Dushevsky from The Independent. I've got just three very small points. The first, we were talking about relations with, as it were, the near abroad. Sorry. I've just got three short points, I hope. One, we were talking about the relations with the near abroad and the need for normalising relations. And I think the recent visit of Yushchenko to Moscow, where he was received as a head of state, where they reached an agreement which did away with the sort of strange middle way of communicating over gas prices, was actually a move in that direction. Second point about Bob Service's point about instability from below. I mean, we did see a little bit of that, I think, in the street demonstrations which seemed to come out of nowhere, I think in the winter of 2004, over what they called monetising benefits in kind. And it seemed to come out of nowhere. The authorities found it, so far as I could see, very, very dangerous. And that in some ways, some of the things that Putin and his government have done can be explained by the fear, not of revolution from the right, but of revolution from the old left. And the third point, which is really rather arrogant and catty, in Bob Service's talk about Medvedev as the next leader, and is Putin making a terrible mistake, as you said rather sardonically, that Medvedev is in no way the heir of Putin philosophically. Well, I would like to put that in a slightly different way. I mean, doesn't it maybe cast doubt on some of the popular interpretations of what Putin's been about for the last 8 years? Thanks.
Well, does it? I mean, that's a good question that you might want to talk about.
I mean, I'd say the one thing about the relationship between Putin and Medvedev is that no one other than Putin himself knows how that relationship will actually carry out. I don't believe that there is anyone who has you know, it is controlled by Putin. The whole script of the last 4 or 5 months has been written by one man, and there's been no input from other people. I mean, as far as Medvedev is concerned, I think the interesting thing is that you said that Putin was speaking till 2020 and said he's got this grand plan. What Medvedev is doing is saying, well, I'm actually around till 2012. So what happens after 2012? I assume what's going to happen is that Putin is going to come back as president for another 2 terms of president. If Putin is saying, I have a plan for Russia and for the development of Russia that lasts till 2020, that's one interpretation. I think that Medvedev will try and make a difference. However, his ability to be different will be very circumscribed by events and by Putin himself. I think what you're going to get is a very strong prime minister, a very strong government, and I don't think you'll get Medvedev talking himself into a position of conflict.
Would you see that? Is it possible that once he assumes the trappings of power, he would want to exert them far more than his mentor has foreseen?
Well, I think that's always happened in the history of the human race, really. Once you get the red telephones, if they still have whatever colour telephones they have these days, you want to use them. But it's Putin that has the sort of popular mandate behind him, isn't it? So we will see. On your point, Mary, I think the two men may agree on what the problems are, and that Putin would be the first to admit that he hasn't solved the problem of the economy, and he has not solved the problem of the rapacious bureaucracy. So they definitely agree on what needs to be done. Whether they see eye to eye on how to do it is a different matter.
We've got time for maybe 2 more questions. Did I take one at the back there? The lady in...
I hesitated really because it's not a question, it's a comment. The idea of a position based on friendship has a precedent in Henry II and Thomas the Becket.
Yes, my name is Alan Taylor. What troubles me is this network state that's been referred to, where personal contacts are the way of getting things done, and the inevitable backhanders that seem to be going on. And Robert Service highlighted something that's totally fascinating. How much is Putin worth? I've read somewhere he's worth more than some of the tycoons that are on asylum over here or own football clubs. And also, what troubles me are these extrajudicial killings that have been going on.
Yeah.
I'm a solicitor, and one of my clients was the deputy leader of the Liberal Party, and he got bumped off. We don't know what's happened to Golopov's murderers. And we have famous journalists who have been killed. And the inference tonight we've heard is that we should shut up about these things. It's not our business. We're guilty of lecturing Russia. But why can't we raise these issues? Are these legitimate questions to raise about what is going on within the sovereign state?
Oksana, would you like to reply to that?
Yes, I mean, I think one should certainly raise this issue if you have a client, representing, if you have somebody who, if you're a lawyer, defending, or if you are, have a, there's an outlet for raising that, and that is the European Court of Human Rights. And in the last 2 years, there's a remarkable number of Russians who went through European Court of Human Rights, who appealed against the Russian state and were granted the decisions, very publicly. And there is a number of NGOs in Russia now that, function even in the North Caucasus, where actually those cases, being assistant of those cases to be elaborated. And there is second outlet, there is a Council of Europe, where Russia is a member, and where Russia has taken upon itself, certain obligations as a member of the Council of Europe, and which it should certainly be held accountable if it is violating it. But in terms of the foreign policy strategy, I think we have to rise up on a slightly different level and try to understand how we develop a strategy, towards Russia, which will make it less likely, rather than more, that those kind of trends are going to continue. And I think what we see at the moment, again going back to this issue of civil society, I mean there had been for a long time this strategy of supporting civil society as the West understands it to be, and I think this very much legitimate idea to support the human rights groups, Memorial. They were doing a fantastic job, but unfortunately within the Russian society, those kind of groups, for better or worse, occupy a very small segment and has very little influence, not because of the lack of information. I mean, I remember Anna Politkovskaya, who told me several times that she's appalled about the fact that she's publishing in Novaya Gazeta all this information, but actually there's no reaction tomorrow. She's expecting, well, here we go, here's press, there's information about corruption in the military, but there is no response from the society. I think we need to see how we can shape and change the society so it actually comes to the point where it holds its authorities accountable. In my view, that we need to support what Russians see as civil society, and I described some parts of it, what I see traveling across Russia, various groups of activists, trying to form local organizations on the local level, perhaps not necessarily around the issue of human rights, but essentially about the issue of human rights, protecting the consumer rights, protecting environmental rights, protecting other issues. And I think we need to support those kinds of activities rather than simply banging on the door and saying hey, there's another murder. And talking about murders, I think it is tragic, but if we look at the 1990s, this is when we had a situation of the passions of the Shakespearean proportions, where, on a daily basis, in Russia there were more businessmen who were murdered in the streets of Moscow than everyone who died in the war in Chechnya. There were on a daily basis, if you look at the statistics, there were tens and hundreds of people who were simply murdered, shot down, murdered in the most horrific way. Now, yes, this is going on, and we've seen recently several murders. But I think one has to understand, this is not, what was happening before. And I think there has to be a way to see that in the perspective. And surely we need to think about the way how those things will not happen at all. But I think they are, that the Council of Europe is the right vehicle. About Putin's wealth, I mean, what is your source of information? Obviously, if Putin is worth 10 or 15 billion dollars, surely the Western governments know where this money are. Surely, some information would have come out. I mean, $10 billion or $20 billion is not $10 million.
I think there's a questioner in the audience who wants one last question we'll take before we go into Mr. Putin's bank account.
Hi, my name is Magda Walter. I've had a sort of a theory that I wanted to just quickly bounce off the panel because I know we have very little time. I mean, it's not so much a theory as watching the Russian story over the last 10 years since Putin came to power, and I lived and worked in Russia as a journalist in the waning years of Yeltsin. It seems to me that he's been very consistently very strategic about everything he's done, both on the domestic front and on the international front. That he's had very clear strategic objectives into where he wanted to bring Russia, say at this stage, and perhaps further along that way in 2020. And he's followed that strategy very consistently, whereas the West, on the other hand, has not been strategic, as it's been said here, has been tactical and opportunistic in its response to Russia, whether it was the war on terror or the price of oil. And it really has been blinded, especially Britain and the US, by the war on terror and how and when Yeltsin was useful to them. When he stopped being useful, it became a revolution. But Putin, on the other hand, has had a very consistent strategy. He's had a communication strategy on the domestic front. He's had an international strategy about strengthening Russia and protecting its borders. And he's had an economic and strategic strategy about energy dependency and having the sort of controlling stake in energy supplies that will let Russia be as big as it is.
Would anyone like, in the few minutes we have left?
I'd love to have a go. Because I'd like to respond to what was said right a couple of questions ago, but tying it into what's just been said. We do have an opportunity to tread on the throat of our song, to not notice things if we don't want to notice things, and then we won't be called lecturers. Terrible thing to be called. We can go that route. Think of the number of countries where there has been a lack of reporting over really terrible things happening. How many reports were there, for example, about the Chinese famine at the end of the 1950s coming out from China? Well, there's nothing like that happening in Russia. Nothing at all like that happening in Russia. It's a complicated country. I'm not pushing a black picture. I think it's dark grey. There are some very positive things happening. Small businesses do exist. I do contend, though, that they have a hard time getting licenses and operating without connections with the criminal mafias that are all over the country and so on and so forth. And I would say another thing. Russia is not antagonistic fundamentally to Europe. Two great pipelines are being built at this very moment to circumvent Ukraine, to avoid the problem of pipelines going across Ukraine, where the Ukrainians very often take off quantities of oil illegally and so on. One's going across the Black Sea, the other's going across the North Sea. The Russians need us.
So
we have to certainly keep a sense of proportion. But the idea that we shouldn't speak our minds is an absolutely crazy idea in this globalized world, that we should somehow just step on the throat of our song, which is what you journalists and we academics are here for.
I'll let Alan have the last word.
Well, in response to your question, who has the more strategic vision, I would say ever since the Soviet Union began to crumble, Washington has not hesitated to view the Kremlin as the loser, and the Pentagon should be the winner, should expand NATO, set up its missile sites in Poland, move into Central Asia. On the economic front, at the Yeltsin time, when Moscow was full of monetarists reorganizing the economy, always at the back of the US Treasury's mind was, we don't want this country to become strong again, we want to weaken it. So I would see a very clear strategic line. And contrary to what you said about Putin, I think on September the 11th, he thought, the Americans are in need, I will open myself up, I will love the American people, and everything, and we will be partners together in the war on terror. His hopes, which are probably rather naive, were dashed because the Americans said, no, we're going to put our troops in Uzbekistan and you name it, and we're going to keep them there. And as a result of that, Putin changed his mind and said, we must, we cannot be partners with the Americans. We have to strengthen our borders, strengthen ourselves.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank our panelists for coming. I think there's always a temptation in these discussions to reach for the Churchillian quotes about riddles in puzzles, and then, but I think we've established one or two points agreed on what happened in the 1990s, the certain inadequacy in the Western response to Putin, and the need to engage in the future in these very broad terms. So if I could ask you to give a round of applause to our panelists for a very illuminating